Brandis, a growing number of companies say they will require proof of vaccination before opening their doors. The Biden administration is working with private companies to develop standards to prove vaccination status, though it doesn't have plans to implement any kind of federal program yet. This comes as the United Kingdom plans to test the so-called vaccine passport concept and as Israel's Green Pass system has been in place since February. And joining us to discuss legal and ethical considerations are Craig Klugman, a bioethicist and professor at DePaul University, Colleen Connell, executive director of the ACLU of Illinois, and Daniel Rodriguez, Harold Washington professor of law at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law. Welcome, all of you. Craig, briefly describe for us what a vaccine passport would look like in the context of COVID-19.
So a vaccine passport is simply a government-issued piece of paper or app that notes that you have been vaccinated for COVID-19. And we've had these since 1969. This is one that was created by the World Health Organization for yellow fever. And so it's not a new concept, but that's what it would look like. And most of the ones we're talking about now are electronic. So it would be an app on your phone.
And Daniel Rodriguez, what kind of legal standing would an organization, say the Chicago Cubs or a restaurant or a public sector organization like a library have if they chose to enforce vaccine passport or proof of vaccination?
Well, it depends, first, as your examples note, whether it's a public sector or private sector. The requirements are not identical, and the powers that an entity, an organization would in fact depend in no small part about whether it's public or private. So a public organization would have some amount of authority. If it's a state and local government, they would have to find that sourced in a state statute or state regulation. They would certainly be subject to civil liberties issues and potential objections from individuals, and they would have to turn square corners with respect to the requirements they impose, but also that the rights and privacy considerations that they provide. Ditto private organizations, although it's fair to say that private organizations and businesses from the Chicago Cubs to the local restaurant would have a wider latitude to require such restrictions and regulations on their employees and their guests.
Hey, Colleen Connell, what kind of civil liberties issues might crop up if organizations were to go this route, or public entities?
Again, just to echo Daniel, it really depends on whether it's a private or a public entity in large measure. I think it raises serious constitutional but not insurmountable issues for government to mandate vaccines or a vaccine credential or passport. I think that moving from the public sector to the private sector, companies have been allowed broad latitude to determine the conditions under which they will operate their business, so long as they don't use the wrong reasons. So, for example, a healthcare employer might be able to require employees to have a vaccine as a condition of employment, but if that healthcare employer enforced that vaccine requirement in a discriminatory way, say only against women or only against people of color, that would raise legal issues for that private entity.
So a lot of things that organizations will have to keep in mind. Craig Klugman, equity has been a big issue in terms of the rollout of a vaccine. How would equity play into the concept of a vaccine passport?
Well, it will echo what has happened with this disease and with the vaccine rollout, right? So people who have gotten it the most, who have been hospitalized the most and died the most, are people of color and older people. And they are also the same people who are less likely to have the devices. The Biden administration has been looking at 17 apps that are being developed. They're all private companies. They said the federal government won't want one. And you need to have the smartphone in order to have this app appear on it. So that's one issue. Another issue is that if this is used to prevent or to admit access to public events, say a concert or a ball game or to a specific restaurant into more public areas, then people who have been discriminated against in terms of the pandemic are likely to find themselves more discriminated against because they are least likely to have access to this vaccine that is now necessary to have entry into these fields. So you have lack of access to the technology because, again, it's not going to be a piece of paper this time around. and you have lack of access to the vaccine that's necessary to be able to partake in our public life.
And Daniel Rodriguez, as Craig mentioned, you have 17 private companies developing some kind of app. The Biden administration is going to give them guidance. What would you guide the Biden administration to guide these 17 private companies in developing something like this?
Well, without delving too deeply into the technology, which is, shall I say, above my pay grade, let me give maybe a little bit of a positive spin on Craig's description, which I agree with. I think the question of developing an app in order to require individuals to actually present a smartphone and show through the app that they've become vaccinated is problematic for just the reasons he said. Maybe not insurmountable, but raises some issues. If instead it's in 2 stages. So he put up the visual of the yellow passport. If the app moves in the direction of providing a mechanism by which the government can actually provide something tactile that you can print out and actually have a document, the Biden administration would work very hard to do that. I think that would be enormously beneficial. I should also say that I agree with him about the access to the vaccinations. What a vaccine passport would look like today, where there's still tremendous problems of access, I think would be very different than what it will look like maybe 2 or 3 months from now, where, God willing, we have much more resort to providing supply of vaccines and also equitable distribution.
So a vaccine passport might have to be a long-term project based upon more of the population getting the vaccine. Colleen Connell, what about privacy concerns if this becomes an app, if private companies are developing an app, if governments require some kind of electronic app, do people have to worry about hacking and whether their health information stays secure?
Yes, I think all of those are serious considerations. I think that for such an app to meet at least some really important considerations, it should really make it clear that the user controls the app and the information. And there should be safeguards written into it that the concept of informed consent, which is really what underlies our entire medical, care system in this country. You have to give informed consent to a procedure or to sharing information about that procedure. And I think that's really important. I think I would also want safeguards against using the device to track the movement of people who have that device. And you would also want, I think, some pretty serious restrictions on the commercial sale or other use or sharing of information on that app.
Very quickly, Craig Klugman, we only have a few seconds left. We mentioned Israel, the EU. How are their passports, for lack of a better word, working?
Well, in Israel, it's working exactly as we laid out here. So if you want to go to particular restaurants, particular events, you scan a barcode that shows up on your phone and allows you access. New York State has just recently started this with their Excelsior program. So again, if you want to access public things, you put this on. It gets checked against the state database of who's had the vaccine or not. So it's not taking your word. It's harder to forge, say, what the screen would look like, which is another issue. And then you can go in. One of the issues that is really concerning about all these is this question of autonomy, the right to govern yourself. And if these are being used in a way as a carrot, an incentive to get people to get vaccinated, then that makes them a really good thing. But if they're being used as a stick, as if you don't get a vaccine, you don't get access to things, that can be more problematic.
So that's a very important distinction there. All right, so much to consider with this. And our thanks to Craig Klugman, Colleen Connell, and Daniel Rodriguez. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.